Well, thank you. Nobody in the U.S. knows how to pronounce Creasy either. So I get called lots of things. Creasy's okay with me. I'll go with that. And because I have to leave immediately afterwards in order to catch a flight, I'll say thank you now. I was here 15 years ago. I keep bumping into people who were at this retreat we did in the middle of nowhere. I don't know where it was, but there were woods and trees and berries and trolls. I don't know, but it was really fun. I still don't know how to play the cup game that we were playing there, but anyway, I meant to be back before now, so it's really fun to be back. And I don't know, I have really good luck with Lutherans generally in terms of youth ministry. They're really fun in the U.S. too, and maybe twice as much fun in Norway. I don't know. So anyway, thank you. It's been a blast. I love hanging out with Morton and Astrid, and you guys who have had them for I think you know how lucky you are that they are at the helm of the youth ministry project here at MF. But if you don't, you should know how much they are respected and adored internationally. So they are your national treasures. So we love them too, just as much. All right, so let's get to it here. All right, I'm sure you were thinking about this morning. In 1909, the American Blacksmiths Union, see, I knew you were thinking about it. I had to check and make sure that blacksmiths would translate across our language barrier. But the American Blacksmiths Union was having issues with their membership. There was a dip in membership. And so they issued a call to all of their members and said, hey, we want to make sure that we have enough blacksmiths, so would you make sure that all of you blacksmiths invite one other person, somebody else, to be a member of the Blacksmiths Union this year? And American blacksmiths responded like champs, and they did. They got all their friends to become blacksmiths and join the Blacksmiths Union. And so the next year, there was a rise in the number of blacksmiths in the Blacksmiths Union. But within a decade, of course, the Blacksmiths Union, or the blacksmiths profession, was practically dead. You know why, right? Want to guess? Yep. Because that happened, right? Because the year before that, actually, Henry Ford rolled out the Model T. So it wasn't that we didn't need leaders in the transportation industry. We did, right? But the transportation industry was changing, which meant the kind of leaders we needed for the transportation industry had to change as well. I want to suggest that I think it's possible that today theological education is preparing better blacksmiths than we have prepared in our history to date. But of course, theological education and the church is changing, which means we are going to have to change the kind of leaders we prepare with it. Now, all week we have been asking all kinds of questions about what this shift in the church means for the kinds of leaders and the kind of church that we're going to need. And in particular, one question keeps coming back, and that's this. Just how much of what we call church are we willing to let go of in order to follow Jesus? Now that's a question that we have to ask with humility, which has been pointed out this week. But let me introduce to you some people that I'm guessing you know. If you don't know these individuals, you know people like them. So let me just walk you through a few of them, and you think about the people in your life that remind you of them. This is Chad Hauser, who lives in Dallas. He is a chef. He started a program called Cafe Momentum. He was one of Dallas's top young chefs. He owned a 4-star restaurant, but when he was 25, he sold it to his partner so he could teach kids coming out of prison how to cook. So what it works is, after a training period, Chad's trainees, they host pop-up restaurants. You know what a pop-up restaurant is? So what will happen is Chad talks all of his restaurant friends into giving over some of the finest restaurants in Dallas to these kids, and they take over for one night, and the kids they take over all of it. They welcome the guests, they cook a 4-course dinner, they offer the finest restaurant service. It's $100 a plate, and the locations are kept secret until it's announced one day on a website, where they sell out in less than 10 seconds every time. Now, Cafe Momentum has one of the lowest recidivism rate. You know what I mean by recidivism? You don't go back, right? It has one of the lowest recidivism rates of any rehabilitation program in Texas. And if you heard Chad talk about his kids and the care and intentionality that he pours into his training and the way he loves every teenager and the way these teenagers talk about loving him back and the way they learn to love themselves, you would think exactly what I thought when I met Chad last fall. You would think this guy is doing incredible youth ministry. Except Chad did not found Cafe Momentum as an act of faith. The church has nothing to do with Cafe Momentum, and Chad has nothing to do with the church. Maybe you know somebody like Ricky Stab or Anders Lindvall. They were film students in California who were working in Hollywood with A-list directors. When they began to worry about their purpose in life, they were in their early 20s, and they got some support from their Hollywood connections to quit their Hollywood jobs. They moved to Philadelphia, and they founded the Neighborhood Film Company. And what they do is they hire homeless people to be their film crews. They make commercials for companies like Nike and Anthropology, and they work on films that are based in Philadelphia. Now, Anders and Ricky they're evangelical Christians, but they did not turn to the church to help them serve the homeless. They leveraged their networks in Hollywood to do it. You might know a teenager like Uwezo Flewellen. He lives in Atlanta, and math came easily for Uwezo. He's a 9th grader. But when he was in 8th grade, that would make him 13 years old, he realized that a lot of kids in his school were nowhere near his math level. And in fact, they were nowhere near where they were supposed to be as 13-year-olds, partly because there was a huge cheating scandal that rocked the schools in Atlanta at the time. And so Uwezo, as a 13-year-old, started his own nonprofit organization called Simple Math Today, where he basically paired up kids from the high school with junior high kids, so 15-year-olds would be paired with 13-year-olds, to tutor them in math. And the math scores in the middle high grades rose exponentially, all right? He said he could have asked his church for help, but his church, he said, didn't really seem to get it. So he did it on his own. Now, technically, none of these ventures were ministries, but I'm guessing it would be impossible for anybody in this room to witness the transformation that you would see happening through Cafe Momentum, through the Neighborhood Film Company, or through Simple Math Today. You would be unable to see the love or the care or the passion that these young people have. And you would not be able to look at that without saying, what I see there, what I see going on there, that is a glimpse of God. I know that you've seen it too, that you've seen the way God employs young people in ways that they're not even aware of, right? But God is using them so obviously, so incredibly, bringing pieces together, working out transformation in people's lives, massive ways that churches are struggling to keep up with it. You might have heard about some of these. Natalie Hamilton this past fall in California, she's a 16-year-old who was bullied when she was younger. She invented an app for her phone, Come Sit With Us. You know, where you just put your app on your phone if you don't have anybody to sit with at lunch. And you can go find a place in the cafeteria to sit with. You know, Jennifer Trianto was a chronically ill 16-year-old herself who founded her own nonprofit when she got over her own chronic illness called Pile of Puppies. This is just genius, right? Where she takes a pile of puppies to chronically ill children to play as playmates, right? And out of her own illness, she came up with this idea. It's interesting. She's not a Methodist, but she might, I think Odd and I might be the only two Methodists in the room. But just as an aside, John Wesley wrote this medical manual, okay? And one thing he says, let's not question the medical knowledge of this, but if nothing else works on a stomach ache, try holding a warm puppy to your stomach. Okay, just saying. Okay. We talked about this a little in our workshop, that in St. Louis there was a teacher that was trying to figure out why kids were chronically skipping class, like missing a month's worth of class. And it turns out she goes knocking on everybody's door saying, why don't you come to school? And it turns out the reason is because we don't have any clean clothes to wear. We don't like being made fun of because we stink. So she calls a local washing machine manufacturer and says, hey, what if you donate a washer and dryer to the school? They did. She let people come do their washing anytime they wanted to at school, and it turns out kids come to school a whole lot more often. Like, their attendance rate skyrocketed. So did a lot of other things. These are not technically ministries, and yet none of us would be able to look at this and not say, God is at work in what is happening here. And if we don't name these as a glimpse of God, no one else will. I don't know, maybe you've seen Elizabeth Gilbert's. She's got a famous TED Talk on creativity, and as part of it, she describes these dancers in northern Africa, right, where they gather in the moonlight for these sacred dances that go on for hours and hours. And every once in a while, one of these performers kind of seems to step through a kind of a sacred portal. And while he's doing the same steps that he's done 1,000 times before, on this particular night, he seems to sort of step through in some undefinable way into something that seems transcendent. And as Gilbert puts it, he seems lit from within, on fire with divinity. And people would recognize that, and they wouldn't just say, oh, that's great. They would take it one step further, and they would put their hands together, and they would start to chant, Allah, 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 right? Which means God, God, God. There it is. I see it. And what happened was the Moors eventually turned that into Allah, 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 Ole, 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 with the bullfights and flamenco dances in Spain, right? But what Ole means is, there it is. I see it. There's God. A glimpse of God. I see it in this moment. I see it in this young person. I see it in this ministry. Ole, Allah, bravo. There it is. Right there. A glimpse of God. So the question is, what are we supposed to make of the fact that we're doing ministry in an era when a lot of young people with worthy dreams and God-sized visions might find it easier to enact them outside of the church than inside of it? I mean, when was the last time you heard a young person reflecting on worship saying, Ole, bravo, there it was, I saw it, a glimpse of God? Turns out, frames matter. How we frame the church makes a huge difference to the way we experience church. And sometimes we just draw such a tiny little frame around this thing we call church that young people just can't figure out how in the world their big dreams would ever fit inside of it. Any art dealer is going to tell you that how we frame something is going to make a huge difference to what kind of sense we make of what's inside of it, right? Here's an example. In 2007, there was a guy that was playing a violin inside a Washington, D.C. subway station. He played for 45 minutes during rush hour. So the subway is the train stations in Washington, D.C. Here's a part of it. Uh-oh, sound. I thought I didn't have a sound clip. Hang on. He played 6 classical pieces of music. He made $52.17 from people dropping money into his violin case. One woman dropped in a 20. Of the 1,097 people who walked through that subway station, you want to guess how many people actually stopped to listen? 6. Okay? And it turns out all the children wanted to stop, but all of their parents yanked them away, right, to keep going. Here's what people didn't realize, that the guy, first of all, the guy was playing on a 300-year-old, $3.5 million Stradivarius violin. He was playing Bach's Chaconne, which is considered the hardest piece ever written for the violin by Bach. And the guy who was playing was, anybody know who this is? Joshua Bell, who's considered one of the world's premier violinists, okay? Only one woman recognized him. She was the person who put in the $20 bill. She'd seen him at a concert a couple nights before. So this was an experiment that was put on by one of the national papers, and they called it Art Without a Frame. What they were trying to figure out was whether people would recognize genius if it was right under their noses, if it didn't have a frame to put it in. And of course, turns out, we didn't. In other words, how much value our story has a lot to do with the frame that we put around it. This is 4-year-old Marla Olmsted. She lives in Birmingham, New York. A few years ago, she was hailed as an artistic genius of abstract art. What a great story. A 4-year-old did that. Now, I know you're thinking, my 4-year-old could have done that. But this story sold these paintings for thousands of dollars. This was like, just what, like wildfire. In fact, so much that they did a documentary about Marla, and in that documentary, it was guileless. I mean, that they didn't think there was anything wrong with this. So that it was revealed that her dad was making suggestions to Marla. Like, why don't you try some red over here, you know? Well, when that came out, then it turned out that she went from being this artistic genius to being a 4-year-old who colored with her dad, right? And what happened to the paintings? They became worthless overnight. The paintings didn't change. The story that framed the paintings changed, right? The frame got smaller. And so the paintings became worthless as a result. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that the value of the church's story has a lot to do with the frame that we put around it, right? And the thing is that the frame of the church's story has gotten to be really, really small. In the United States, sociologists have called this frame, the way we frame the church's story, moralistic, therapeutic deism. That's what most Americans think religion is all about, including Christianity. Basically what that means is most Americans think religion is moralistic, it helps you do good, it helps you be nice. It's therapeutic, it helps you feel good about yourself. And it's deist, God pretty much stays out of your way. You know, that's what most Americans think religion is about, and what's more, that's pretty much what most American churches teach. Now that's the dominant religious message that young people hear in the United States. In other words, we've gotten used to framing our story in such a little tiny, tiny frame that the church is a nice institution, and God just doesn't have very much to do with our lives. And so here's the one thing we can be sure of. If the church isn't going to paint a very big picture for God, young people are going to go out and paint their own theological message that is bigger, right? They're going to paint it out of whatever they've got. So, for example, the ecological movement is a secular eschatology about the end times, right? About the hope for the end of the world, hope for the future. Celebrity culture is a secular form of worship, right? Social entrepreneurship is a secular mission movement. And so what's happening is, in the absence of a big enough frame provided by the church, young people are left to go invent one for themselves. No wonder the church's value in the world has slipped. When we don't tell a big enough story about God, the church's frame gets so small that the religious picture becomes one big selfie, right? There's room for us, but there's not much room for God. Which means there's no room for grace, or for resurrection, or for Emmanuel, God with us. Which means there's no room in the church for ole, for a glimpse of God. So young people who are hungry for significance, who are hungry for something that matters, seek it without us. So you see, when youth are God's instruments of change in the world, these young people that we know and admire, they're not just showing glimpses of something good, they're showing us glimpses of God, and in some cases, they're doing a better job of it than the church is. I'm not sure when the church went from being a culture of yes, ole, bravo, a glimpse of God, to a culture of no, we don't do that. Yeah, we don't have time. We don't have the volunteers. We don't have the money. I don't know when the story of God went from what God is doing in the world, went from being huge to being manageable. I don't know when people started confusing the church with Google, just don't be evil. I don't know when we started using young people as cheap labor to accomplish our ministries instead of accompanying them alongside their ministries. But somehow, over time, young people got the picture, loud and clear, that the church is for people who think small. It's a good place for good ideas to go and die. At the same time, and we've been saying this here all week, entrepreneurship is in for millennials. You've seen this slide before this week. Forbes calls social entrepreneurship the new black. Young people see themselves as creators of culture, not consumers of it only. They're innovators, contributors, makers. Use whatever metaphor you want. Half of them want to start businesses or be a part of a startup. A lot of them already have started some businesses. They're very optimistic, perhaps somewhat deluded. If they want to change the world, most of them think, or a lot of them think they're going to do that on a global basis. These are global statistics, by the way, not American ones. In the U.S., we're very concerned with the fact that 1 in 3 18 to 25-year-olds no longer affiliate with any religion whatsoever. Meanwhile, both in the U.S. and Norway, it takes 6 or 7 years of education if you want to become a pastor, right? You don't have to have any degree if you want to be a youth minister. In the U.S., there's a crisis in theological education because fewer people are getting theology degrees, and those who do get degrees, fewer than half expect to use them full-time. There's very little vocational connection and no vocational incentive for creative young people, whether it's in politics or the arts or social service, to think that the best place to use those creative instincts should be through the church. As a lawyer, maybe. As a filmmaker, okay. As an educator, perhaps. As a social entrepreneur, yes. As a youth minister or as a pastor, wait, why would I do that? We could panic, or we could recognize that a shift is happening in the church, and we can support the young people who are moving us in this direction. But we have to remind ourselves that these disconnected young people are not the enemy of the church. They're not even against the church. They're just outside the church. And here's the kicker. Every reform movement the church has ever known has begun there, outside. Starting with Jesus. Jesus preached the kingdom of God, and what he got was the church. And that had to be something of disappointment, right? Jesus didn't ask people to come to church. He asked them to follow him. Jesus' mortal enemies were not atheists. They were the most respected religious leaders of his time. You can't reduce him to a social justice jock. His ministry was not to make a point, but to respond with radical obedience to an all-loving God whom he called Father. But among his contemporaries, Jesus was anything but that good religious guy. What got him killed was blasphemy, which was the primary sin against religion. In the early church, religious people were deeply suspicious of Christians. The first Christians met outside religious sanctuaries. The first Christians criticized the status quo. In Norway, apparently young people don't protest except through music. I've decided. The first Christians, they were all social entrepreneurs in the sense that they viewed their jobs as way to pay for ministry that fed and clothed the poor and that buried the dead in a society that had no welfare system. That's what your day job was for, to provide resources that took care of other people. The monastic movement, the Protestant Reformation, all of these started by going outside the established institutions of the church, and they were reform movements, responses to bloated institutions, and so these people left their bloated institutions and set up religious institutions apart from them. Not to make a point, but because they heard God better outside the institutional church than inside of it. So when I remember where religious reform comes from, it makes me think a little differently about the exodus of young people from our established congregations. Maybe it's not unbelief that causes young people to find sacred meaning in work they do outside the church. Maybe it's a stripping away of what stuff that needs to get stripped away. Maybe it's an example of something Bonhoeffer called back in the 1940s religionless Christianity. Bonhoeffer watched the German church fall under Nazi control and watched church leaders look the other way as horrible stuff happened. And wondered, well, if you can't distinguish the church from the culture around it, maybe there's another way to be faithful, even if it means leaving the church as we know it. In the U.S., we allow radio hosts to be theologians. So Garrison Keillor puts it this way: give up your good Christian life and follow Jesus. So I want to be clear about this. Young people aren't leaving the church as an act of faith. They're leaving because they can't think of a good reason to stay, okay? But they can think of a good reason to be part of something greater than themselves. And we'd be dishonest. And I don't think we'd be filling our responsibility either if we didn't say to these young people who are truthfully answering a call that is being awakened deep inside of them, Ole, bravo, there it is, I see it. I see it in you. I see it, a glimpse of God. When I was pregnant with our daughter Shannon, our son Brendan was 3. And we decided, it'd be best to wait to tell him until after our first trimester that he was going to have a little brother or sister, mostly because I was doing a lot of throwing up at the time. It had been a rough year for our family. My grandmother had died, and then my dad had died, and Brendan had spent a lot of time in the hospital visiting people hooked up to a lot of medical equipment and then going to funeral homes. And since I was so sick when I was pregnant, I was hooked up to an IV to combat dehydration. And at about that time, my husband Kevin found Brendan kind of hiding in corners, practicing crying. He was like practicing being sad, And Kevin eventually figured out that Brendan, who had only seen, intravenous stuff in hospitals, thought I was going to die. Okay, well, that's when we changed strategies, right? We're like, okay, forget the first trimester thing. So we sat Brendan down on the couch and we explained to him that I wasn't dying, that there was a baby in there, and all of these tubes were to keep mom and baby healthy. Brendan never got past, there's a baby in there? And it was like time-lapse photography. His face went from sad to what to awesome. It was like the whole Easter story in one moment on a 3-year-old's face. From death all the way to resurrection in a second. And there it was, a glimpse of God. So, we can accept the small frame that's been put around this conversation about the church. We can accept this story about irrelevance or secularization or about, fewer baptisms or dwindling influence. But I'm convinced that right now is the best opportunity we've had in a century to reframe this conversation. What if the church came alongside the Chad Hausers and the Anders Lindvalls and the Uezo Fluellens, and what if they don't even know it's ministry, but they heard from the church that we saw in them a glimpse of God? What if the church is experiencing contractions because every new birth requires them. What if the church is in transition? You know, like when a baby is coming? I don't know if this is a book you guys have here. This is like the Bible of everybody who's pregnant in the U.S. And if you look at the signs of labor, it looks a whole lot like the situation of the church in the U.S. anyway, you know? And it's this time of transition, it's messy, it's intense, it's uncomfortable, there's a lot of cussing, I don't know, but there's no turning back, right? Because new life is coming, it's coming ready or not, and we can either get ready or we can get out of the way. But if you look at the signs of labor, then signs of new life coming, then it suddenly seems obvious, right? That as a church, we're not dying, we're pregnant. So I want to leave you with this crazy kind of upside down idea. That what we're talking about here are signs of new life. Signs that God is up to something good and wants us, the church, to proclaim it with young people in the church and beyond the church. To see it wherever we see it. There it is. I see it and I see it in you. Ole, bravo. There it is, a glimpse of God. It's our job to give young people a big enough frame to see God in their selfies. To show them that where their dreams intersect with God's plan, to show them and remind them that in a culture of no, Christ has already said yes to them. To connect these youth to the most creative people that we know in the community of faith, to Christians, the people of God who stand behind them chanting, there, I see it in you. Ole, bravo. You are an example of it, a glimpse of God. In the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, in the name of the Holy Spirit, Ole.